Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Bridget Kendall.
Hello. It's been called the best club in the world, a global family and an extraordinary cultural tapestry. It's also been described as a group of nations held together by little more than a name, the English language and a passion for cricket. And some say it's a talking shop that fails to stand up for its core values. I'm talking about the Commonwealth. Over 60 years old and 54 nations strong. But how well adapted is it for the 21st century? Sir Don McKinnon is a former New Zealand Foreign Minister who for 8 years found himself at the eye of the storm in the Commonwealth as its Secretary-General. Tory MP Kwasi Kwarteng draws on his Ghanaian heritage to question the legacy of empire. Journalist Francis Harrison has been documenting the troubling human rights record of Sri Lanka, the controversial host of this year's Commonwealth Summit. And Caribbean diplomat and writer Sir Ronald Saunders sees another challenge looming, the rise of China. Don McKinnon, you've just written a memoir of your time at the Commonwealth, In the Ring, a Commonwealth memoir. And so let's start by defining this big, sprawling organisation which you found yourself trying to be in charge of. By your own description, it was an amazing but much loved yet misunderstood institution. So how do you define the Commonwealth?
I think that's where everyone stumbles, really, because the Commonwealth, it is truly global. It is seen differently from Africa. South Asia sees it differently. Southeast Asia sees it differently. The Pacific see it differently. The Caribbean see it differently. And here in Europe it is seen differently, and particularly in the United Kingdom. So you're never going to get sort of one definition which everyone will say, yeah, that's it. And I think this is very much the reason that the Commonwealth moved back in the early 1970s to say, look, let's really concentrate on selling the benefit of core values, core good democratic values. And that's really what's holding much of the Commonwealth together today. People enjoy being part of an institution where they know they can ascribe to those values.
Kwasi Kwarteng, your family's from Ghana. What do you think Commonwealth membership means for a country like Ghana today?
I think the most important thing about this is obviously the shared English language, which is a big cultural asset. Also, there are shared memories. I mean, my family, as you say, came from Ghana. It was the Gold Coast then. My father has a memory of listening to the 1948 Olympics on radio on the BBC. And I think there are shared memories and shared associations. So in many ways, I would emphasise the culture and also the shared memories. How that determines the organisation going forward is an open question. But I think it's very much something that lingers in the memory as a fond recollection of the past, really.
OK, we've had democratic values, we've had shared culture and memories. What about the Caribbean, Sir Ronald Saunders? You're a former senior Caribbean diplomat.
Well, I think what's important to the Caribbean is that the Commonwealth offers an opportunity to its leaders of very small countries to interact with leaders of big countries like Britain, Canada, India, Nigeria, South Africa. These are opportunities. This is an opportunity that would not be available to them were it not for the Commonwealth. At Heads of Governments meeting, you've got the Prime Minister of a country like St. Kitts and Nevis with a population of 50,000 people being able to have a personal discourse with David Cameron from the United Kingdom or for Stephen Harper from Canada. These are not opportunities that turn up often, but it gives them the chance to spell out their own problems in a way that they can best do it to a man who at that point is their peer. And he then has a better understanding of their challenges and is therefore able to articulate it in other fora, such as the G7 or the OECD or the European Union.
What about South Asia and Southeast Asia, Francis Harrison, where you've been correspondent? Very big countries there like India who are members, but also very small countries. Is that the big pulling power of the Commonwealth there, do you think?
I think primarily language and this cultural understanding is very strong. I feel that because I mean, I'm a product in a way of empire because my grandfather was Indian and then Pakistani, and that link simply wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for empire. And it's something that now, when I go and meet my relatives in Pakistan, there's that language bond, that historical bond, as well as obviously a blood tie. It's something that's very, very, very close, and it's not the same with other countries where there wasn't that history of colonisation, unfortunately.
The big question, I suppose, though, is, I mean, a lot of these things are about memory, aren't they? 60 years of the Commonwealth.
Well, I'd take that point, but I'll also just add on to Kwasi's point. You see, when we talk about the English language, I also say we speak the same language, not the English language, the language of our institutions. We have the same parliamentary systems, judicial systems, accounting systems, medical systems, the lot. So you can travel from one Commonwealth country to another, and whatever they're talking about, you will have an understanding, apart from cricket even. So that binding is just more than just an English language. It's that heritage of those institutions.
But is it an organisation which is beginning to lose its way, which is finding it difficult in the 21st century?
Well, as you know, I was a member of the Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group during the period 2010-2011 that did the report for the Commonwealth Heads of Governments Conference on
this is
reform.
set up to recommend reform.
To reform on the Commonwealth. And we took a great deal of evidence over that year and a half from all sorts of places across the Commonwealth. And clearly what came out of it was a sense that people felt that the Commonwealth was losing its way, that the values for which it said it proclaims, it says it stands, were not being upheld by the association, because increasingly there were violations of those values in a number of countries, and that the the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, CMAG, which was set up to look at such violations and to recommend action on it, had begun to concentrate only on looking at the unconstitutional overthrow of a government by a coup, and had restricted themselves to that activity, but were not looking at other errant behavior by governments, which needed to be done. That was a very strong point. And in fact, we took it on board. And at that point, we had suggested that what the Commonwealth needed to rectify that problem was the appointment of a Commissioner for Democracy, the Rule of Law and Human Rights. As it turned out, the consensus at the meeting in Perth in Australia in 2011 was that that should not go forward. And so we haven't got it. And in my view, that is a sadness, because it stops the Commonwealth from being effective enough about dealing with violations of human rights that are and rule of law and democracy that go beyond just the unconstitutional overthrow of a government.
I want to explore this question of how you deal with countries that violate human rights in a moment, but I just want to stop for a moment on this question of history and culture in the Commonwealth, which is clearly, as you said, Kwasi, some kind of glue. But I wonder also whether does it represent continuity, or is it baggage from the past?
I think it obviously starts with the British Empire, and I have a slightly different view in terms of the question of, does the Commonwealth need to find its role? It's always been trying to find its role. The Commonwealth, I think, from the beginning of decolonisation, since the Second World War, the nature of Britain's relations with the former empire, with the Commonwealth, has always been something which has been discussed. There's been no definitive answer, as Sir Dom suggested at the beginning of the programme. And I think that's just an ongoing debate. I don't think there's any more uncertainty about the future of the Commonwealth today, any more than there was probably in 1970. I think it's always been something which has been discussed. People have always been wondering what Britain's role was, what the Commonwealth countries' role was, and their relationships to Britain. And this is a dialogue that's always been uncertain, if you like.
Well, that always comes up, but I think one has to look at how does it deal with issues when they come along. Some it can deal with them most effectively in terms of, here's a country that has transgressed in a variety of areas. Engagement occurs with the Secretary-General or CMAG, and often we have seen a slow change, and you bring that country back into the fold, and they accept the fact that they were chastised for a period of time. It hasn't worked all the time. As I found out in my term, no matter what I tried with President Mugabe, there was no way that he was going to really adhere to the Commonwealth values that he had signed up to, which he was breaching in those subsequent elections. As long as the Commonwealth is persisting in trying to do these things, it's never going to get them 100%. And as you know, we're looking at events that occurred in Sri Lanka not so long ago. And when I was in office at that time, our ability to engage with Sri Lanka on these difficult issues was almost impossible, because the Tamil community saw the Commonwealth as friends of the Sri Lankan government as opposed to themselves. So we weren't sort of permitted to be the friend of the family helping out in any way. And you can only act in a productive consensus way if you're an accepted person by both sides in these problem areas.
So actually you're saying its power to influence is quite limited. You have to have the right conditions. And if you don't, then you have a situation like Zimbabwe where Robert Mugabe just walks out.
And I think we did have the right conditions in Nigeria, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Fiji and others, where we were dealing with similar problems, but none of these countries wanted just to walk out and stay out the way Mugabe did. They are prepared to remain engaged, and slowly you do have wins. But look, one thing I've decided, you do not change a country's political DNA overnight. It does take time.
But nonetheless, what the Commonwealth can do, the only sanction it has is actually symbolic, isn't it? It's the threat of suspension.
And that's a big one. No individual likes getting sacked from a job. No individual likes getting thrown out of a club. No individual likes being blackballed by their friends. And that is very true in the Commonwealth. I felt one of the biggest weapons I had was to have a quiet tete-a-tete with any leader and say, you know, your fellow leaders may want to put you on the CMAG agenda. And that was something that really focused their mind.
What do you think, Ronald Sanders? Do you think that suspension is a meaningful sanction? Do you think it's enough?
I think it is. I think Don is right that nobody wants to be suspended from it. But you must recall that we've had more than one withdrawal from the Commonwealth. It's Pakistan, South Africa withdrew under apartheid to start with in 1961. It came back in under Mandela. Pakistan withdrew under one Bhutto, and another Bhutto brought it back in. The father took it out. Benazir Bhutto brought it back into the Commonwealth. Mugabe has withdrawn it because the country was about to be suspended, and he knew that. This was under Don's time as Secretary General, which he gives a fantastic account of in his book, and for that reason I think everybody should read it. But the point is that suspension is something, but there are other sanctions that are open to the Commonwealth. For instance, during the South African apartheid regime, one of the things the Commonwealth did was to have the Gleneagles Agreement, which stopped sporting contact with South Africa, for instance, and that really hurt that country at that time because their rugby team couldn't tour, their cricket team couldn't go anywhere, they were a pariah. And that was, I thought, a sterling contribution by the Commonwealth to isolate South Africa in a way that made its people think, is this something we want to continue with?
Sanctions against ruling families have an enormous impact on a single country. When you say that, you shall prevent any member of the leadership or the leadership's family leaving the country, coming into your country, getting education outside their own country, focuses the mind very, very clearly.
I think Ron's point about the moral suasion, if you like, of the Commonwealth was particularly brought out in the apartheid regime. And clearly you're right to suggest that sport was a big factor in making white South Africans, Boer South Africans particularly, question what the basis of their government, because that really hit sports mad South African audiences, and I think that's exactly where the Commonwealth can actually contribute and where its strength lies. But it's moral force. It's not a physical thing or particularly in terms of armies and that sort of thing. It's a kind of moral suasion, which Sir Don was talking about.
But that's a very long time ago, South Africa, isn't it?
Quite
the
a long
world
time
has
ago.
changed. The question is, Has the Commonwealth, does it need some new weapons, some new approaches to deal with today's interconnected world, or is it just not doing enough? What do you think, Frances
Well,
Harrison?
I think it could use the same weapons better. In the case of Sri Lanka, it's not that it's about to be suspended necessarily, it's more that it's being rewarded for basically committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in 2009. It's being allowed to hold the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. That's something that really could have been used as a reward for good behaviour, if you like, rather than just being handed to them on a plate. And I think that basically calls into question the brand of the Commonwealth. It taints it. You have a country that's killed, according to the United Nations, 40 to 70,000 of its own people in 5 months. And that's not your average human rights problem in a Commonwealth country. That's something way, way beyond that. And so to have heads of government go to Sri Lanka, particularly to the president's home city, and have them endorse this regime is very, very questionable.
This is the big issue facing the Commonwealth at the minute, isn't it?
I think it is right now, and I think Francis is right. If Commonwealth heads of government go to Sri Lanka under the chairmanship of the president of Sri Lanka, whose regime is under accusation by the United Nations Human Rights Commission of violations of human rights, then they would be sending a very bad signal about what the Commonwealth is. And it would call into question immediately whether the values that the Commonwealth says it stands for really are values it says it stands for. I think the organization would be weakened considerably. The moral suasion about which we've heard Kwasi talk about would simply no longer exist. And in my view, the Commonwealth would weaken itself almost beyond repair if heads of government go to Sri Lanka.
Just sketching for us briefly, Francis, your concerns about Sri Lanka's human rights violations. You've been looking particularly, haven't you, at the last 5 months of the very long and bitter civil war that there was in Sri Lanka and the number of people killed then.
Yes, the last 5 months of the war were quite different from the decades before, albeit also dreadful. But the last 5 months involved government forces shelling and areas where civilians had gathered repeatedly, deliberately targeting hospitals, shelling food queues, using supersonic jets against really defenceless civilians in large areas. And yes, there were war crimes, of course, committed by the Tamil Tiger rebels as well. But
using people as human shields.
Using people as human shields, not allowing them to leave some of the areas, recruiting children. But if you look at the UN report on this, the scale of war crimes committed by the government and the scale of killing, the majority of it was by the government forces. And that's a lot of people say, OK, well, that happened in 2009. We're 4 years on, let the country develop, put the past behind it. But from what we see now, that's not happening. There's no attempt on the part of the Sri Lankan government to address the root causes of the civil war and the ethnic problem in Sri Lanka. In fact, they're simply refusing to do that at all. And the continuing amount of torture, rape, disappearance is quite shocking. It still continues in the north and the east. There's still heavy militarisation. There's a policy of trying to move Sinhalese, the majority community, into the Tamil areas to dilute their populations there. So this is not really over, this war, at all. It's being fought really under the surface in a covert sort of way in the north and east. And what we're now seeing, of course, with the impeachment of the Chief Justice in Sri Lanka is an erosion of the rule of law in the southern areas. So I think you're seeing people who initially supported Mahinda Rajapaksa are now questioning the way that he's taken over so much power and concentrated that into the hands of actually his family and the people around him. And that's very, very worrying for Sri Lanka's future.
Well, why do you think, Don McKinnon, that the Commonwealth decided to have its summit meeting in a country like Sri Lanka, which was clearly a troubled place?
Well, I think the international community let itself down on Sri Lanka, not just the Commonwealth, probably the UN too. If you look at the reports, there was always a reluctance to push very hard, but more a question of can we get a communique that everyone can agree with. And really the sanctions that came out of it at the end weren't really that much at all. As one who watched this over a long period of time, you just knew there either had to be a settlement at some time. And I worked with Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was then Prime Minister, who was very close to getting a settlement, I think. You either got a settlement or there was going to be one huge train wreck. And there was no settlement, and we got the train wreck. The thing is now, it hasn't gone away, as Francis said. The people are still there. These people are still on the one island. They do have to learn to live with each other. It's going to be a whole building process all over again.
But do you think that having the Commonwealth Summit there is a mistake? If you were still Secretary-General, would you be recommending going?
Well, the Commonwealth leaders decide this, and I won't go into some of the history of it, but in the end, 54 leaders around the table are saying, well, do we go to Sri Lanka or don't we go to Sri Lanka? And what
do you think they should do?
That's clearly what would have happened. At the present time, I know the current Secretary-General, I can't speak for him, is actively engaged in dialogue with the Sri Lankan government. Obviously, President Rajapaksa wants to have a successful CHOGM. You won't have a successful CHOGM if a number of leaders decide, I'm not going to go.
Well, yeah, the British government, Kwasi, I think it's clearly uneasy about the decision. It's said it's not clear what level it wants to be represented at. Do you think it should refuse to go?
Well, I think it's very difficult for a British government, because Britain has symbolically a very strong role to play in the Commonwealth, and I think anything the British government does will be interpreted, or could be interpreted, as a sort of Commonwealth-wide policy. It could be interpreted like that. There's also another factor in terms of the domestic political scene, in that there is quite a large Sri Lankan community in Britain. So as a Member of Parliament, I have been lobbied, not so much by Tamils who live in my constituency, but Tamils who live across the UK have identified Members of Parliament and are making us increasingly aware of some of the outrages that Francis was talking about. So there are lots of factors that you have to balance, and that's why I think the British government has adopted the cautious approach that it's done.
I mean, what surprises me, though, is that the British government seems to lag behind other countries on this issue. So when we look at CHOGM, it seems to lag behind Canada. That's taken
CHOGM is the delightful name for the summit of the Commonwealth Heads of State. Gosh,
yes, using the acronym. It seems to lag behind Canada. That's basically questioned whether its Prime Minister will indeed go. And then when we look at the UN process in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, it's the Americans that have been spearheading a second resolution against Sri Lanka, and albeit the Indians, of course, are going to support this resolution again, it looks like, which is very significant. And Britain is really, again, not showing leadership at all.
But that's exactly the difficulty that I've tried to illustrate, is that because of Britain's historic associations, because of the nature of many of the communities within Britain itself, any kind of action is going to be looked on and interpreted and possibly twisted in a certain way, and that's why they've been cautious. Now, we can say that it's a shame that they haven't shown leadership and the government is dragging its feet, but you can understand the historical sensitivities behind it, and you can understand why the British government is more cautious than other governments might be.
You're saying the baggage of empire means it's harder for it to lead the way?
Well, yes, it can be. It can be a drag, because we have historic associations, we've got large communities in Britain itself, and that necessarily will make the picture more complicated.
Next-door neighbours always have difficulty, I find. If a single state has a major problem sort of against the rest of the world, the immediate neighbours will always be much more cautious about that state and what's going on there than will those that are further away. And the other factor here is, as a result of those decades of appalling activity in Sri Lanka, the Tamil diaspora around the world is enormous.
Huge, yeah.
And it is a huge political lobby.
That's right.
So things are being kept alive, very much so, that, one just hopes, and a lot of when one's in these sort of jobs, you just got to hope for the best, that the government realises you do have to reconcile at the end of the day. You are living on the one island, you've got to get together.
But meanwhile, there has to be a summit before the end of the year, and if the Canadian Prime Minister doesn't turn up, or Britain isn't represented by its Prime Minister, I mean, this is a huge test for the Commonwealth's credibility, isn't it?
Well, it's a huge test for the Sri Lankan government as well, and they'll want to succeed. So, yes, there's tension there.
It's not very long, though. It's, November that it's happening.
Yeah, and the important thing about this is that where a summit meeting of the Commonwealth is held should not be in the interest of the country that wants to host it. It should be in the interest of the Commonwealth. And if governments of the Commonwealth were to use that as their criteria, then I don't think they would be going to Sri Lanka. A country that hosts a Commonwealth Heads of Governments meeting is given a badge of respectability by the Commonwealth as a whole. The Commonwealth says, yes, this is a place that we approve of, and that's why we're going there. That's why we're going to sit under the chairmanship of the head of government of that country. Now, if you have the kind of controversy that now surrounds Sri Lanka, And we must remember it's not just the question of the atrocities that the regime is accused of and that the UN Human Rights Commission is looking at. It's also the recent impeachment unconstitutionally of the Chief Justice of the country, which is a direct violation of the Latimer principles of the Commonwealth, which sets out the relationship between the executive and the judiciary. And with all of that going on, and with that kind of controversy, a government would have withdrawn itself in order to, if it had the Commonwealth's interest at heart. Since it's not doing so, because it wants to be a showpiece, it puts other governments in a difficulty. And while I understand what Kwasi is saying about the British government, we must also remember that the Commonwealth stopped being British a long time ago. This is the Commonwealth of Nations, not the British Commonwealth. Britain is just one member, an influential member, undoubtedly, an important member, undoubtedly, but not the only member. And the Commonwealth is not controlled by Britain.
But this is the paradox, is it not? Because on the one hand, what you say is absolutely true, to suggest that Britain is just another country. But then on the other hand, Francis is saying Britain should show leadership. I mean, why should Britain show leadership if it is a Commonwealth of Nations? So there is definitely a tension here. It's not something.
Well, it should.
It's not simply
Britain's leadership on South Africa was against the wishes of the other
absolutely
53
right.
countries.
I know, but that was a huge deal. That was a big significant thing.
This can be used for the wrong way.
But that's the paradox I'm trying to draw out. On the one hand, you're saying quite rightly that Britain is merely a country; it's not a British Commonwealth. But on the other, people do expect some kind of leadership.
Well, it is a member of the Commonwealth, and an important one. And while it's not a British Commonwealth, one would expect Britain to show some lead in all of this.
Exactly, but there's a tension here. I mean, I'm
not disputing the tension. I agree that it's there.
It's interesting, Don McKinnon. You said democratic values. That's at the heart of the Commonwealth, not just for Britain but for everybody. But you need to take a softly approach. And yet, if you look at what's happening in Sri Lanka. With the removal of the Chief Justice, you could say that softly Commonwealth approach, you're waiting for things to get better. Actually, by being softly, they're just getting worse.
Well, you could be right. I'm not. Don't have that fingertip feel for it. Look, I'm one of my part-time jobs now is I'm special envoy to the Maldives because they've had quite significant political problems there. Now, I've always got to keep in the back of my mind, their democracy is 4 years old. They are going to make mistakes. They're going to have situations where the judiciary pushes against the executive or the executive tries to marginalise the legislature. And, some countries, you've just got to work alongside them assiduously, pointing them in the one direction, insisting on those values. So when you get a Sri Lankan situation, which I say has been building up for a long period of time, you've just about got to go back to square one and start all over again.
It's interesting you bring up the Maldives. Also had a rocky relationship with the Commonwealth recently, because it leads one on to the question of values versus interests. Maybe you've got the Commonwealth saying you've got to have better democracy, but perhaps you're looking as a small country in where your interests are and where your trade opportunities are, and that's at the forefront of your mind. And this brings us on to the question of China, the big giant in so many international questions, and its growing influence with many parts of the Commonwealth. I think it's single biggest trading partner for Africa now,
Sure.
Growing massively in the Caribbean. Ron Saunders, yes?
Well, it's everywhere. If you look at almost every country, including Australia, its biggest two-way trading partner is China. And the only countries that's not yet happened with is Britain and Canada, of the big Commonwealth countries. But in Africa, in the South Pacific, in Southeast Asia, unquestionably China is their biggest trading partner. And it is going to have a difficulty for the Commonwealth. Where the Eminent Persons Group was functioning, one of the things that we looked at, we didn't actually say anything about this in a report, but we talked about it, was the fact that China was very much the elephant in the Commonwealth room because it was everywhere. And the question is that China is not a democratic nation. It does not respond. Its own human rights record is not wonderful. Therefore, it has a sensitivity to those issues in the international community. And we know that with those countries, the small ones in particular, with which it exercises a considerable influence because of the loans and grants that it gives those places, it's already told them how it expects them to vote, for instance, should there be an expansion of the United Nations Security Council. They've made it clear that they would not wish those countries to vote for Japan to get a permanent seat. So it's beginning to flex its muscles.
But also China brings in infrastructure and much-needed loans, especially at a time when Europe, the United States, are economically burdened.
Absolutely
can't necessarily
true.
Provide the same sort of thing.
That is true, Bridget, but there's a price to be paid for all of that. And the price is going to be paid. And in fact, for some countries, it's a, because China does not attach to its loans and its investments requirements for human rights and democracy and the rule of law, as is being done increasingly by Western industrialized nations. Governments find going to China for these money is a convenient thing to do, but it's not just free, because China does expect something in return. And what it expects in return is that in the international community, China will not be criticized on human rights. There will be no criticism over Tibet, and people will not support Taiwan to be a separate state from China. So those are things that China expects to get in return for those things. But here's the other thing. If a country runs afoul, a Commonwealth country, of Commonwealth values, in the sense that it violates the values of the Commonwealth, China continues to underwrite them. And the typical example of this is Fiji, which is now in suspension from the Commonwealth, but which is getting massive investment from China to keep the regime going.
And Sri Lanka. I mean, half of Sri Lanka's aid budget now comes from China. China is basically building new roads, developing the president's hometown. Chinese workers and investment are huge in Sri Lanka, and they don't ask questions about war crimes, and they support Sri Lanka in any kind of UN forum.
I think it's important, this is where you think about engagement. One thing I started during my time was regular annual engagements in Washington, D.C., the White House, State Department, National Security Council, Capitol Hill. I wanted those people to know what the Commonwealth was, because we were actually all doing the same thing in different parts of the world, promoting democracy, etc. I did pay a visit to China about 2005 as Secretary General in a semi-official way, but I thought this country's growing so fast. I want them to know about the Commonwealth at the official level. It's not something they just read about in the paper. They should be able to understand what the Commonwealth does, why it's there, what its purpose is, and therefore you kind of reduce those misunderstandings when you have some dialogue.
But do you think that China is loosening the bonds of the Commonwealth family by encouraging these links which are based on trade and not on values?
No. Look, Commonwealth members, they go where there's an advantage, but they don't drop off the old friends that rapidly. Yes, I've heard threats, we're going to leave the Commonwealth, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. They don't. They hang on very tight, but they'll go in different directions. The people in the Maldives are saying, get rid of the Commonwealth, we're going to reassert ourselves in the Islamic Conference. Well, they probably will. But I can bet you they won't leave the Commonwealth in the process. It will be talked about.
And one thing we haven't talked about is the fact that other countries which had nothing to do with the British Empire want to join the Commonwealth. I mean, I understand Algeria wanted to join. Madagascar. I mean, this is not a failing organisation. If people who had no connection with Britain whatsoever are wanting to join this club, if you like.
Seven Commonwealth members were former German colonies.
That's right, but they...
Kwasi Kwarteng, there are some in your Conservative Party who say Britain would be better off revitalising its trade links with Commonwealth friends, especially at this time when they're doing, some of them, rather better economically than the European Union.
Yes, I mean, this has always been a dialogue within the Conservative Party from the 1960s, when Britain was trying to join the EEC. People even at that time were suggesting that Britain would be better off joining or furthering links with the Commonwealth. And I think it is paradoxical, because at the time that we joined the EEC in the early 70s, Europe was this great economic powerhouse. Today, it's less appealing from an economic point of view. And you're right to suggest that countries like India, but Canada, Australia, other countries are playing a bigger role in the world economy. So it's natural that for people to be arguing that Britain should be extending its links. But it's neither. The problem with this debate is that it's always framed as either or. it's always framed as you're either going to be in the EU or you're going to go into the Commonwealth as a sort of exclusive thing.
You cannot replace the EU with the Commonwealth.
No, you can't, and that's right. They're different. You know, just as someone can be a member of more than one club. You can be a member of the EU, and also you can be a member of the Commonwealth. They don't exclude each other.
But is there a shift? Because clearly there is a shift in global power and global trade. Is there a shift now away from values and towards more the importance of trade links?
Oh, I don't think that's a constant. That's there all the time. Trade, incomes. That never lets up at all. But I come back to the British role, which has bounced around a little bit. You know, Britain is a good member of the Commonwealth, but remember this: for every £1 Britain gives the Commonwealth as part of its levy, the EU gets £350.
Sure.
So there's a huge difference in what you can do with either of those institutions as you are the payer, as opposed to being the payee.
What do you think is the answer to the growing power of China, though? Do you think it should be invited to join if it wants to? Was that too big a barrier?
I'm not sure they would rush in and adopt all of our values. Would they necessarily adopt the Queen as the head of the Commonwealth too? So that could be a challenge for them as well.
Well, now that's an interesting question, isn't it? The Queen's
before we get there, Bridget, the thing about China and whether it would join the Commonwealth, of course it wouldn't. And one of the reasons is that China wants its bilateral relationships with countries to be China's. In other words, China negotiates that relationship. China gets the maximum out of that relationship that it wants. Dealing with Commonwealth countries through an association of the Commonwealth wouldn't suit China, because it wouldn't want to deal with a monolith of 54 countries. Far better for China to deal with countries individually, where it can get the maximum benefit out of that negotiation.
Don McKinnon, you mentioned the Queen's role, and I just wanted to bring up this question, the problem of succession, because it's right, isn't it, that the role of the head of the Commonwealth isn't inherited like the monarchy. And actually, in your time as Secretary General, you stuck your neck out a bit on this and pointed out that when the Queen goes, it's not automatic that her successor would take over the Commonwealth, because member states would have to decide for themselves.
Yes, that's right. And of course, it was very easy last time because it was so long ago, and there were only about eight members in the Commonwealth. So it was not even half a telephone call for an agreement that Queen Elizabeth would become the head of the Commonwealth following George VI. It is a bit different this time, and there's no question there are a number of the realms, and there are 16 realms, 16 out of 54 countries who still recognise Queen Elizabeth as the head of state. And there's a few of those thinking, do they want to remain a realm? None of them would actually wish to say it out loud or too loudly. None of them would wish to say we're cutting our links with Queen Elizabeth as our head of state. But a number are saying, well, when she goes, yes, that could be we might have a rethink. Therefore, the role of the head of the Commonwealth, and I do dwell a bit on this in my book because I talk with so many heads about it. And the amazing thing is you can sort of follow a kind of a scenario. Well, if you don't have the British monarch, who do you have? Well, you look for a prominent citizen somewhere, and you find that citizen, and then 5 years later you've got to look for another one. And then 5 years after that, someone says, but hang on, our region hasn't had a turn yet. And you almost go the full circle and come back, well, actually, it's quite easy and quite convenient to stick with the British monarch. But that's yet to be seen. But it is within the hand of the heads of government themselves.
Kwasi Kwarteng, do you think the British monarchy should have a leading role in the future in the Commonwealth?
Well, I think it probably will. I mean, I just have to...
I asked should.
Well, I think if people want it to, then it should. And also, you have to look at what's happened in the last 2 years. We obviously had the royal wedding in 2011. We've got the Diamond Jubilee last year. These were global events. I mean, they were far bigger than the Commonwealth. I mean, I was travelling in Gulf states, and all eyes were glued to this pageantry, if you like. So I think that the British monarchy still does have a kind of global pull that countries in the Commonwealth can respond to. So I'd be very surprised if that many of the realms, as you suggest, rethink and leave or disassociate themselves from the British royal family.
Ronald Sanders.
Well, I mean, let's look at what we're talking about here. We're talking about the headship of the Commonwealth, which is titular. the head of the Commonwealth has no executive power, no ability to change anything that governments and countries do. What this Queen has done is to give the Commonwealth star quality. And the Commonwealth has not had to pay a penny for it in all the years that she's been there. It's been free. For instance, when she goes to Commonwealth Heads of Governments meetings, the Commonwealth doesn't pay. When she holds a dinner for all of those Commonwealth Heads of Government at those meetings, the Commonwealth doesn't pay. When she went to the United Nations 2 years ago and spoke for the Commonwealth in one of the most impressive speeches about the Commonwealth that I'd ever heard, Commonwealth didn't pay. And the Commonwealth is getting all of this free publicity of star quality that costs it nothing. Now, if we were to replace the Queen with somebody we elected every 5 years, the Commonwealth would suddenly find it has to pay for the head of the Commonwealth. We'd have to pay for our office, we'd have to pay for staff, we'd have to pay for travel. The cost of the Commonwealth suddenly would escalate beyond the capacity for people to pay.
That would kill it off.
But that was my point about the global pageantry and the fact that everyone was looking at these celebrations. And as Sir Ron said, in terms of advertising, publicity, if we want to use those sorts of words, the royal family is a huge asset to the Commonwealth.
Francis Harrison, briefly, what do you think about in South Asia? Would they want the British monarch to carry on being the head of the Commonwealth?
Difficult to say. I mean, I think the star quality, the way it pulls in people, yes, I can see an almighty row there if you didn't have the Queen, who her successors, to which country would hold that post if it rotates all the time. And we'd have similar issues that we're having with CHOGM, with the heads of government meeting, arguments over whether this particular country was suitable to have that titular role. So perhaps it's better to stay with what we have.
Thank you very much. We wait to see on that one. And you've raised an interesting question for us to look at, Don Mackinnon. Thank you.
Might have to wait for a long time, too.
Well, we might. Indeed, we might. Thank you to all my guests. Sir Ronald Sanders, Visiting Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. Kwasi Kwarteng, Conservative MP for Spelthorne. Sir Don Mackinnon's In the Ring, a Commonwealth memoir, is out now. And Francis Harrison's Still Counting the Dead, Survivors of Sri Lanka's Hidden War, is out in paperback. Next week, Anne McElvoy is here to discuss the state of feminism. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.